So welcome to Queerguru, and I'm really excited because of the people at the Mardi Gras Film Festival, which comes out in February. It wasn't for them, I wouldn't be talking to you today, because they spotted amongst all the very busy program a retrospective for Stephen Cummins, who died of AIDS in '94, age just 34, a filmmaker, and you were his creative partner. So can you start with telling us about Stephen and what this perspective means to you?
Stephen obviously was a filmmaker of great talent whose work got cut off early. Yeah, he only got to the age of 34 and was reaching a sort of a certain peak. But I think in looking at it 30 years later, what we really have is we have this body of short films from the mid-'80s to the mid-'90s that sort of reflect a lot of changes happening within queer culture at the time, within filmmaking, within representation and politics. You know, we start out with Stephen in '84, it's like a 24-year-old art school, the sculpture department, you know, doing quite sort of formal studies, but you can sort of see hints of an eroticism and an emerging sexuality. I mean, the first couple are in the year that homosexuality was decriminalized in the state he was living in, you know, so it's really like an emerging thing where people are getting a little bit more visibility, but it's quite abstract. You know, he's got sort of Bruce Weber posters on his wall and sort of, you know, the sculptured body and an appreciation of beauty and an awareness of how queer images are coded even within mainstream culture and advertising. And so there's a little referencing to that. There's diagonals, bodies, but you see a chest rising and falling, and there's a bit of an eroticism. And what we move through over a 10-year period really is the emergence of AIDS, the demand for visibility and recognition by queer people, a more overt politics, reflections of the effects of AIDS in terms of violence, that it really sort of moves through from what you might call an art school aesthetic period all the way through to, you know, really quite direct political polemic. And I think that's how I'd summarize Stephen's work.
Yeah. His work was very experimental, but when we took a look at Resonance, it was very homoerotic as well. And I believe this is a film about gay bashing. Was this autobiographical in any way? I sensed it was.
Yes, it was. See, I'd been Stephen's composer for a couple of films sort of leading up to that, and I just released a sort of a classical music CD with I was working with a guy from the Berlin Philharmonic, and Stephen, there's a piece of music at the center of that, and Stephen said, "Look, let's make a film together." And I said, "What, me as filmmaker as well?" And he said, "Yes, let's do that." And so we using this piece of music, and we'll sort of extrapolate from that, and bringing in all the usual collaborators from who Stephen had been working with from the dance world and from the performance art world, and with me with my music. And so we just started writing something, and it initially was a lot more abstract. It reflected, you know, the way that gay people had to be careful in public and stuff like that. But during the writing process, you know, we did some work one night, and then 20 minutes after Stephen left, there was a knock at my door, and Stephen was at my door covered in blood, basically. He had been really
right. You felt it was autobiographical somehow, because it was so poignant.
It was at the time where there was the big sort of backlash around AIDS. There's very heavy violence in Sydney at the time, and Stephen and I were both living right in the middle of the city, and so it was from his walk from my place to his place. He was attacked by about 4 or 5 guys, beaten up really savagely. I had to take him to the hospital to get stitched up, and that's basically very quickly, within a matter of weeks, actually, I was the one, I sort of wrote out, the night after that happened, I wrote out the entire first scene with images and pictures, and I said, what about this? And he said, yes, I want to do this. Let's make this about bashing. And we worked into the title Resonance came quite quickly because we wanted to look at like a healing process from that being attacked, whether it's someone who's an attacker, whether it's the people who are involved with them. So although it's quite sort of lyrical and still quite experimental, not a lot of clear dialogue, that we're working with gesture and movement and dance, that there was a very essential political thing, and that very much was a result of Stephen being bashed.
Yeah, let's put this into context. It's 1992. It's in the middle of the AIDS epidemic, and you're on the international scene, which I didn't know about. You guys are there in Sundance with B. Ruby Rich in the conversation, the dialogue, out of which became New Queer Cinema, and you were there with some very big hitters.
Derek Jarman, Tom Carlin.
And Isaac Julian, I was going to say to you, illustrious company at the time. How significant was that discussion group for you two?
Oh, it was quite an extraordinary moment, actually. And I think for everybody there and for people who have talked about, that was a real, Sundance 1992 was a real meeting point for a lot of people. What had happened the year before was that Jenny Livingston's Paris is Burning and Todd Haynes's Poison had won major prizes there. And so in 1992, every sort of gay and lesbian filmmaker in the world converged on Sundance, and there was stuff happening in the mainstream. There was Derek Jarman had Edward II, and there are narrative films, not sort of big expensive studio ones, but full narrative films. Still a lot of experimental work, a lot of politics, a lot of people involved in arts activism. There was all sorts of practice going on, and there was a sense of urgency in all of the people there. Like, we were all about 30. We were all about 30 years old. When I had to do a New York Times interview last year about it, I looked it all up, and everyone was either 30, 31, or 32. And so you're at that point where you're at a career launch. But I think there was a sense with all of us, whether, those people who are HIV positive, even those of us who are not, that maybe we only had limited time, and there was an urgency about about queer visibility, about getting stories out there, about getting results.
What I wanted to ask you, looking forward, do you think the filmmakers achieved since then what they wanted to achieve from that 1992 meeting? Do you think we've got queer cinema where they wanted it to go?
I think there's been success in the things that people wanted, but it's more that it's gone off in all sorts of directions where aspects of queer culture are fully integrated into the mainstream. That is very much a part of that. That it's a marketable thing with an audience that's not just queer people. That you've got stuff from Drag Race to Bros to all those sorts of things are there at that very top level. I think maybe among some people at Sundance there might have been there was a feeling that there was a new form being developed, and that's really what Ruby wrote about and spoke about a lot. It was the first one to really theorize this idea that you had experimental practice and sort of non-mainstream ideas coming into mainstream cinema. People were sort of cutting together Super 8 and video and 35 millimeter, that was all happening. But in some ways that sort of diversity of practice has been sort of mainstreamed as well, because you had the rise of technologies where people can just, make a feature film on their telephone and do that sort of thing. But it's not like the cinema itself has been changed, but just that people have a broader definition of what films and cinema are.
How do you think the younger generation will react to this retrospective of Stephen's work? Is he known to our generation?
No, not really, no, because I think when you look at, Stephen's work, a lot of Stephen's work was in little experimental film festivals and things like that. Resonance had its I mean, it was an enormously successful international film. We're at Sundance because we're also at New York and Toronto and Berlin, and it screened at over 100 festivals and was theatrically released in about 15, 16 countries. It was the first gay film ever shown in Taiwan. It really, as a film, it really sort of got out there. But I think the generation today, obviously, that's 30 years ago, that they wouldn't know about it at all.
But I talk about the Stephen Cummins Film Trust. What's that about?
When Stephen, when he died, he was a lecturer at an art school at a major university, and so there was while he wasn't a rich guy, there was, like, as part of that job, there was like a big benefit that would occur in the case of someone's death. And what he did in his will was that he left that to two arts organizations, Queer Screen, who are the organizer of the film festival, and also the Performance Space, dealing with like young performers. And both of those, the idea was to invest the money and use interest to establish annual prizes. So there's basically myself and someone else who have been running the trust for about 30 years. And it's annually the best short film prize at Queer Screen is funded by that. And then also the Performance Space, the performance people, they do like series of workshops and developments with but the idea is like emerging young artists to give them a little boost up to make their next project.
Great legacy, great legacy. I can't let you go before asking you, who is Pauline Pantown?
Who is Pauline Pantown? Pauline Pantown is a character I created 25 years ago. We're really in the past today, aren't we? Basically, I made a drag version of a racist politician called Pauline Hanson, who emerged in the late 90s and started to get a lot of support within Australia. It was a bit of a backlash to the way that Australia had changed and become more multicultural. It was a bit of a last gasp happening there. And basically, and she got a lot of support and was very upsetting for a lot of people of color and Indigenous people. And so I created a drag version of hers. I'd been doing a lot of performance work where I'd taken people's voices and I'd do cut-ups of the voices using digital samplers and things. But I sort of made that into a pop format, and I made songs that took her words and completely reversed the meanings and performed it as a drag character. And the first one was banned after some extensive court action that she took, and then the second one, I became a pop star for about 6 months, and I ran against her for government. Neither of us actually got in on the next election, which was a good thing, and she was unfortunately re-emerged 20 years later and is still around. And so these days, I still have the character, although I don't really perform much anymore. I have like a virtual avatar of the character that I use to engage in like political practices.
She's like your R. Anita Bryant, I guess, in a way.
Yes, in a way, yeah.
Okay, so I'm really grateful we came across this, and thank you. And good luck with the screenings. I hadn't heard of Stephen. I have a great respect for him, and it's really important for us because his work is part of our own gay history, and we won't know who we are unless we appreciate where we came from. Good luck with the screenings, and thank you for talking to me.
Thanks very much, Roger.